TCI is brought to you by Spendthrift's Golden Sense, the brilliant 3-time Grade 1 winner and best son of Into Mischief. Look for his first yearlings at Phasing Tipped in July.
Welcome back to TCI, your inside track to the Triple Crown. Alongside Joel Cunningham, I'm John Siegel. Well, Joel, this show wraps the Triple Crown season. It's been a long season, an interesting season. We picked 1 and 3 winners this year. You had Always Dreaming in the Derby. Didn't fare too well in the Preakness, but you did have Cloud Computing in there, a horse that you identified with a shot to win the Preakness. But let's talk about the Belmont real quick. You had Twisted Tom in there, a horse that you felt qualified with the dosage like we talk about. Joel, he didn't really run too well in the Belmont Stakes. Tell me what you think of his performance.
Yeah, it was a similar idea with Chad Brown running Cloud Computing, a horse that qualified for non-winner one allowance, winning the Preakness. Now, Cloud Computing has shown quality. I mean, he made the TCI top 10, John, when he ran so well, I believe it was in the Gotham. And I really thought that he was a wood contender. Had the race maybe set up for him and speed backed up and would have set up for a closer, maybe he would have been. They tried to fast track him to the Derby, and he just didn't make it. I mean, he only had 3 lifetime starts prior. So they did the prudent thing, and the horse really came along in his training and won the Preakness. Well, Twisted Tom was another horse to me that a little bit different. You know, it always shown that he was maybe a cut below. A New York bred gelding, not very highly regarded. They took a lesser path with him, but he did win 3 in a row since adding blinkers. And I did love his pedigree at 1.5 miles. Now, class was always a question. However, we've seen class isn't usually as big of a factor in the Belmont. We've seen some not very classy horses win that race at 1.5 miles, John, that were sitting on big performances and locally based. So it was that was sort of the factors in what I liked with Twisted Tom. Now, if you listen to trainer Todd Pletcher, Tappert won that race going into the first turn, and I happen to believe him. I mean, if you look at Twisted Tom breaking from the 1 hole, Tappert breaking from the 2, both riders ass coming out of the gate. Tappert was a horse that we talked about last week that has some tactical speed. Yeah. If they want to ask him to get involved early, he's shown in his Gulfstream Stake race earlier this year he could be forwardly placed. Same thing in the Sam Davis. He was forwardly placed right there in the pocket. That's where they put him. They rode him out of the gate, put him and use his speed to get in position right off in that second flight, stalking right behind Irish War Cry as they came out of the first turn. A perfect place to be as the rail was inside was pretty good all day. Speed was playing pretty well, I felt like, particularly in a race that had no pace in it. And what they did was they ran out of there into the first turn, the jockeys, to get position. Then they all put the brakes on. And then you saw that Gallopers race that we referenced. Well, unfortunately for Tappert, they wanted that spot that, unfortunately for Twisted Tom, they wanted the spot that Tappert got. Javier rode out of the gate. His colt, a bigger colt, wasn't quick enough. Tappert beat him to the spot. Twisted Tom was shuffled back, clipped off or checked off of heels pretty significantly. And if you looked at the race, it was a merry-go-round race. The top 4 or 5 horses that had position down the back stretch, had forward position, finished 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The back half of the field never made a run. It didn't play into a closer's type of a race at all. Twisted Tom wound up running 6th in there, John. And you still have to question maybe his class overall, but I will say I do think Tripp certainly enhanced him running as poorly as he did, and it probably also enhanced maybe some of the performances of, again, those top 5 or 6 finishers that were able to kick on.
Well, I've had a lot of people ask me, did Tappert qualify on the dosage chart that we showed? So let's go ahead and pull that chart up real quick, and we'll look back through the race and we can talk about a few of the horses. But you can see here, Tappert, I mean, he definitely qualifies in there. It was right on the border, but he definitely was a horse that qualified to win the Belmont.
Well, first of all, look at number 1 on our list, Epicurus, obviously the scratch. Him coming out of the race, I mean, here's a horse that I don't think there's any question in my mind he would have got a big piece of this, if not win it. First of all, he's a tactical horse, and the idea that really the only horse that didn't merry-go-round around there on the front end was Meantime, who qualified the worst for us. Okay, that was forwardly placed, right? Yeah. Everybody else besides Meantime that was forwardly placed basically held their position all the way around the racetrack. Epicurus would have been one of those horses, obviously, involved in the early pace here, John. But to me, an indication is, okay, Twisted Time, he was the one that qualified the best. Didn't get the trip, maybe was outclassed. He didn't win the race. And look, we're not going to pick the winner every year. But again, you can still get a lot of information from this, in my opinion. Gormley, Senior Investment, Irish War Cry, Tappert, Patch, all had solid qualifying pedigrees. Not super pedigrees, but qualifying type dosage numbers.
Yeah.
They all finished in the top 6, along with Twisted Tom. Obviously, your winner and all your trifecta came from this group. Your bottom 5 in the race were these 5 horses. Meantime, he was involved in the pace. Theoretically, with Mike Smith on him, a low pace, a bad pace scenario, that horse should have kicked on based on the pace of that race. He wasn't bred for a mile and a half. The numbers showed it, and he was not able to hold his position. Obviously, Hollywood Handsome had issues there. We won't talk about him, but Multiplier, completely done going in the far turn. Absolutely nothing. J-Boy's Echo, Bobby Flay liked him enough to buy into him. Now, he's a closer, so was Looking at Lee, who got a good inside trip. Looking at Lee did similar to Derby.
Yeah.
I mean, Looking at Lee always puts in a run. At a mile and a half, he wasn't bred for it, and he put in no run here. I mean, he couldn't do better than the top half dozen in this field that were bred better to handle the distance, John. So I still think you see strong evidence here that pedigree does matter. And again, I really think it comes down to the dosage index. A lot of people criticize the dosage index. And, originally, the main criticism came from when they were trying to qualify Kentucky Derby winners and really getting into these pedigrees and who's qualified to go a mile and a quarter. Well, as we've noted, an eighth of a mile beyond a mile and an eighth is a mile and a quarter is not that significant. I still contend that going a mile and a half, John, over a big racetrack like Belmont, or frankly any racetrack, I mean the Breeders' Cup Marathon, whether it's at Santa Anita, Churchill, whatever, going a mile and a half, mile and 3/4, pedigree matters.
Yeah.
I mean, pedigree matters. Look at the Europeans that came over in the Belmont Gold Cup the day before. They come over and seemingly dominate that race a lot of the time. Now, we did have a pretty good marathoner last year that won it. That was a true marathon type horse, but I think the Europeans ran 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in that race, and that was on the grass. But the bottom line is the depth of stamina. That's what those horses are bred to do. The American horses are not bred to go a mile and a half and beyond. So pedigree does matter. You can disqualify, in my opinion, some horses out of that distance. And to me, you can move up some horses that, even if you question their real quality and class level, you can move up based on the fact of how they're coming in the race and whether or not they have the pedigree to maybe handle that distance better. And I think you saw it again this year. I think you saw strong evidence of that.
Well, not to keep harping on it, but just let me ask you just point blank. I mean, if Classic Empire's in this race, do you think his class could have got the job done in there? I mean, it was a stagger fest coming home, Tappert,
Yeah.
and I mean, those 2 horses were just staggering to the wire. Do you think that, class has to come in at some point too into this factor? Do you think he would have had a chance to win this race?
Oh, class absolutely does come into it. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But we've seen a lot of classy horses that were not bred. I mean, Classic Empire was bred in the red. Now, American Pharaoh, I think he was bred in the yellow, if I'm not mistaken, that year. He had a high dosage number. He had a pretty good Tomlinson, but I did not like American Pharaoh going a mile and a half. Now, I do think some things came into play. I mean, again, he was doing phenomenal before the Belmont. It's the best we'd ever seen him. For a horse to go through that grind and still look the way he did physically, Bob had him on top of his game. There was a speed bias that day at Belmont, clearly. The track was very tight and fast, and they allowed him to walk on the lead. Everything in there, if you remember, was closers. I mean, you had Frosted and Move to Hege, and you had a bunch of closers in the race, and they basically let him get into a long gallop, and that track, he was not going to be beaten that day. However, I look at Classic Empire, again, with a dosage index north of 5. 4th race, like Looking at Lee, 4th race, in 8 weeks, averaging a race every 2 weeks. I would not have liked Classic Empire to win that race. I frankly think the 2 horses that kicked away in the stretch, Irish War Cry and Tappert, and again, this is all conjecture, I think they would have run 1-2 still, and Classic Empire maybe could have been in there with Patch for the 3rd spot. And that's just my opinion. Epicharis, again, he's another horse. I mean, this race had 2 major defections. Epicharis, I still think, turning for home, I think he might be the one that Tappert has to reel in and not Irish War Cry. And again, that's just my feeling on the race. But, we'll never know. And that's what's so fun about this race, going a mile and a half. We talk about it every year. And I still believe that while we don't pick the winner every year, there's still evidence in a lot of this pedigree stuff when you're talking about a mile and a half with these North American pedigrees and dirt horses.
So one thing is disappointing when we don't get a Triple Crown winner, but it's also exciting now as you go into the summer. because these 3-year-olds will still face each other. You still got the Haskell, you still got the Travers coming up.
Yeah.
So now you start seeing some of these, I don't want to call them grudge matches, but you start seeing these horses that now want to come back and justify and say, hey, we're the best out there. Plus you've had some that have been out, they've been out on the shelf for a little bit that are going to start coming back in. We now transition from Triple Crown to where we start looking into the Breeders' Cup and looking at these horses in a different way. Tell me, where do you think we'll see some of these horses? We'll still just talk 3-year-olds right now, but where do you think we'll see some of these colts coming back?
Yeah, it's worth noting that Arrogate, nobody even knew who he was at this point last year, John. I mean, we had 3 different horses win. You had Nyquist, the champion, win the Derby. And I mean, everybody wanted to anoint him. He's your 2-year-old champion, won the Derby. He's going to win the Preakness.
Right.
He's going to be a champion again. Exaggerator, who I thought was the best horse in the Derby, he got the job done in the Preakness. Now, Exaggerator was that horse who came into the Belmont, well bet in the Belmont. I think he ran dead last, John. Didn't have the pedigree to handle it, in my opinion. May have been a tired horse, too. But Exaggerator sort of shown up most of the times, and he didn't show up at all that day at the Belmont. So to me, I think the distance really exposed him a little bit as well. But obviously a Creator win. And then it sort of opened it up the division. We wondered, who was we kind of, in this show last year, we talked about, Destin. And we started talking about maybe American Freedom, some of the Baffert horses. We didn't even mention Arrogate,
right,
because nobody knew about him yet. But always that second half of the year, particularly in a year like this and a year like last year, when you have so many of these horses just beating each other, it really makes it interesting to see who can really make a push. If we would have said, would any of those 3-year-olds last year at this time, this show, could they have beat the older horses and be a real Breeders' Cup Classic contender? We'd have said, frankly, I would have said no.
Right.
But we didn't know about Arrogate, So it's very interesting, how the division's going to shape up, how they're going to do against their older counterparts, when they have to start facing older horses in the fall, particularly leading up to the Breeders' Cup Classic. And when I start looking at this group, John, I mean, the Haskell's the race everybody points for now. It used to be, we want to win the Travers. Well, and that's still a big deal. But if you really start listening to these owners and these people that manage these horses now, the Haskell's the race that they point for, in my opinion, even more so than the Travers in a lot of cases for the summertime. So I think you're going to see, Chad Brown's already said Timeline, who bypassed the Belmont.
Right.
It's pointing for the Haskell. Mark Casse, unfortunately with Classic Empire, the foot issue, they're pointing for the Haskell. I think you're going to see Always Dreaming point for the Jim Dandy. They want to get him back on the winning track at Saratoga. It could be a typey track there. And I think their goal is to win the Travers. It's at the Derby distance of 1.25 miles. They know he obviously handled that, his son of Bodie Meister. So I think that's where you'll see him show back up, John. So it'll be interesting here. I think Irish War Cry, they said the Haskell, is I think where they want to go. I mean, he's a New Jersey bred, so it makes sense that, owner and breeder, they would want to win that race in New Jersey. So it'd be very interesting. It looks like the Haskell's will be a fantastic race. Jim Dandy, I think you'll see Cloud Computing back there against Always Dreaming. So you got the Derby winner versus the Preakness winner again. And then obviously the hope is that, if some others emerge, that's great. But the hope is to get them all healthy coming out of the Jim Dandy and the Haskell. And we see a showdown in the Travers that could have some championship implications, because right now that 3-year-old division is wide open.
Well, it's going to be exciting for sure, man. We'll come back in a few weeks. We'll start talking about this stuff. We got to start talking about 2-year-olds. That going into Saratoga, you always have these good 2-year-olds that are out there. So there's a lot of good things that are coming up. We got the Philly divisions to talk about. Songbird's back. She won over the weekend. That's exciting to see her back for sure. So it's fun. Now we get to open it up, talk about more horses, which is what we love to do.
A ton of fun.
Well, thank you guys for watching this season. Make sure you come back in a couple of weeks. We'll start talking about Breeders' Cup and get you guys educated on some of the horses headed into the Breeders' Cup races.